I've recently seen this article doing the rounds in some of the Facebook groups that I'm a part of, and it's called "The Anglo-Saxons Were Worse Than the Vikings," and I'd like to go through it because I don't really agree with a lot of what's written here. Again, this isn't going to be an attack against the person who wrote this article, it's an attack against some of the ideas that they've put forward in this article that I don't think are particularly accurate. So one of the main points in this is about the Anglo-Saxons and ethnic cleansing and wiping out the Britons, which they put forward as a point of view for why they were worse than the Vikings. So straight away with the caption here, it says it's obviously the Sutton Hoo mask, and it says an Anglo-Saxon helmet from the British Museum in London. Was the warrior who owned this helmet part of a more terrifying and brutal invasion than the Vikings? No, he wasn't, because the person who wore this helmet, it's been dated to 625 AD, and we already know that the invasion happened, we're told in the Gallic Chronicles, in the year 452, that Britain had been reduced to Saxon rule, quote. So if that's happening in 452, this helmet was found in 625, so no, the person who wore this helmet was not part of that invasion, funnily enough. So then, if we go on to read the article, the Vikings invaded England in the 9th and 10th centuries. We also, of course, have the 11th century, which is possibly the most successful Viking invasion of England, with Svein Forkbeard in 1014, and then 2 years later you have his son Knut, who becomes known as Knut the Great, followed by his two sons Harthar Knut and then Harold Harefoot, although their reigns were very short-lived. This is possibly the high point of the Viking invasions of England, because England was incorporated into the Great North Sea Empire, as it was called. But anyway, let's read further and see what else they have to say. So, nevertheless, the reported plundering and ethnic cleansing. Now, I find the term ethnic cleansing a bit I don't know, let's go with problematic. That's always a fun word to use for when it's used for the Dark Ages, because when I think of ethnic cleansing, I think of things like Pol Pot, or I think of the Second World War in Eastern Europe, or Stalin, or things like that. I don't tend to think about this period when these kind of distinctions between groups of people were quite a lot harder to pinpoint, and also because it brings to mind this very sort of mechanical kind of extermination of people, and I don't think that's at all what was occurring in this period, and we really don't find any evidence for this occurring in the period anyway, apart from small bouts of violence that may or may not have been ethnic, and probably weren't at the time. The Vikings simply had worse press coverage by frustrated English monks who bemoaned their attacks. I mean, that's true. If you read many of the Anglo-Saxon sources, they generally don't come off very well as some of the Frankish sources who describe their exploits. But then again, to suggest that this is the only evidence we have about the Vikings, even literary evidence, is simply not true, because we also have, obviously the Vikings themselves weren't writing much down, but we do have runic evidence. Well, if you look at the runic evidence, a lot of the runic evidence is, oh, I put this stone up for my brother who died fighting in England. Or I put this stone up for Thorfinn, who died fighting for the Varangians. So even from their own evidence, we do get that they were quite a violent people. This was a violent period. And later on, of course, one of the big sources are the Icelandic sagas. And yes, they were Christian, and they bring their own biases with that when they were writing these sources down, and yes, time had passed from the Viking Age. But it's important to remember with the sagas as well, is that they weren't just trying to show them as being bad, because the people writing them were often the direct descendants of the people who they were writing about. And often in the sagas, what they're trying to do is to big up their own ancestors for their own gain in the contemporary period, because there was a lot of civil strife in Iceland at the time. So a lot of the time they would try to say, oh, look at my ancestor Egil Skallagrimsson, for example, and they'd say, oh, look how good he was, and that must mean that we have rights to this piece of land. And in the sagas we read a lot of violence. There's an awful lot of people being burnt in their own home, like Brennu Njal, for instance, Burnt Njal saga. As well, obviously, Egil Skallagrimsson, who I already mentioned, he goes off and does a lot of fighting all over the place. So, you know, this is a violent period from whoever's writing about it, even when they're trying to glorify these people. If you read, for example, the skaldic poetry of the period, so many kennings about battle and war and swords and spears and all of this, the ravens, the beasts of battle, you know, even in the Anglo-Saxon poetry that's celebrated, the Battle of Maldon, just been writing about that today. You see lots of this kind of thing. Anyway, but before rambling on too much, what my point there essentially is that while the Viking Age is more complex, and certainly so, than just people coming over and raiding and fighting, because there's much more to the Viking Age. Obviously, a lot of people were just simple farmers, and a lot of the time you can't really tell the difference between people who come and raid and farm. One of the first things that the Great Heathen Army did, after they had successfully defeated all the kingdoms in England apart from Bernicia and Wessex, is to go north, and in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle we hear that Halfdan shared out the lands of the Northumbrians and that the Danes put it under the plough. So people who had just been fighting the Anglo-Saxons turned into farmers, and that's why you get a lot of the place names in northern England, especially Yorkshire, with Norse origin because of this. So it's more complicated, but my point is that we don't just think that the Vikings were violent because of English sources. Pretty much all the sources point to that. It's a violent period, and while we should be more nuanced, it's not the case that it's only because of these monks writing that we realise that this was a violent period and that the Vikings often did bring war to the places they came. So essentially the article then goes on to say that because of new evidence that has recently been discovered, that really the Vikings weren't the worst invaders to land on the English shores, but it was the Anglo-Saxons. So, the Anglo-Saxons came from Jutland in Denmark, northern Germany, the Netherlands, and Friesland. Hold on a minute. Onafhankelijk? Friesland is of course part of the Netherlands,
for now,
despite the interesting punctuation of that sentence, and subjugated the Romanized Britons. So, if we keep reading here, then we see this other argument that they put forward, which is that because some scholars point to Viking meaning pirate, again that's a bit of an oversimplification. There is quite a lot of debate to what Viking actually means. There's many possible etymologies. That then the Viking Age should be considered one of numerous migrations and piracy, and that it should then start earlier than 793 BC. I think that I'll give them this. I mean, there are just a lot of small mistakes like this, like with and Friesland before, and now 793 BC, they mean 793 AD, which is obviously the attack on Lindisfarne. And here they posit that it should really start around 400 BC. Well, I'll give some reasons why I don't think that's true. The Viking Age is characterized by many raids initially from Scandinavians onto other areas, especially Christian centres starting on monasteries like Lindisfarne. Then you also have ones on Rathlin Island, on Iona, then Dorestad, so trading centres, Saint-Philibert in the north of France, all these kinds of places. You don't get that explosion starting in 400 AD, again they mean, with the Anglo-Saxons. That wasn't, the Anglo-Saxons didn't come and raid England, all the time. They came there and they settled there. There's quite a big difference. So while this is true for the Vikings, they did do this. The first Viking invasion of England happened in 865 AD with what's known as the Great Heathen Army. But the first raids really start in earnest in 793, and then the next year you get probably the same band if they were using a base. It's been suggested by, I think it's Alex Wolff suggested that they were using possibly Orkney and Shetland as a base from which to then go down. So they first sailed down the eastern side of the British Isles down to Lindisfarne, which is off the coast of Northumberland today, and then that they sailed down the western side, which is when you get the attacks on, I think, Iona, Rathlin Island, places in the Hebrides in Ireland in 794, 795. And then after that you get a bit of a pause, and then this first years of the 9th century you start getting raids on places in the Frankish Empire, and in 810 you get the first raid on Dorestad, which is in Frisia. And then it begins in earnest. There's many attacks on England first. So you get, it's the raiding that starts the Viking Age, but you simply don't have that with the 400 AD. And just to say because there was an Anglo-Saxon migration into England at this time, it should be part of the Viking Age. Well, migrations had been going on all the time. Like, one of the reasons why the Roman Empire fell was because of this great shifting of tribes. Some from the east would push other tribes out, and then those tribes would come in. That's why the Goths went looking for new lands. That's how you get the Visigoths ending up in Spain. You know, they were originally probably from southern Sweden, where you had the Jotard from these places. So there's lots of migrations going on all the time. Just because there's this one, I don't think you should push back the start of the Viking Age. There has been a case put forward that the Viking Age, which is often said to start in 793, which is the first real raid on Lindisfarne, that should be put earlier. So for instance, one of the reasons is that actually the first violent encounter with Scandinavians in this fashion was in 789 in Portsmouth, or at least it's recorded in 789 in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, but it's meant to have happened some years earlier. We're not sure quite how early. And there is evidence to suggest that somewhere in the 8th century, earlier in the 8th century, is when the Viking Age started. So for instance, we get from runic evidence, we see that the use of runic language is changing throughout Scandinavia. We also see that the two important trading emporia in southern Denmark, we have Ribe, which is on the North Sea side, and then also Hedeby, which is on the Baltic Sea side, that these both became a lot more powerful, a lot more traders started to come there, which suggests that we then get more powerful, localized, centralized rulers. We also see evidence for this in the west of Norway, where the petty kingdoms were becoming powerful enough and secure enough to send people overseas to raid at this point. Also, we get more evidence for this. For example, it's the expansion of the Franks. You get the Danevirke being refurbished around the turn of the 9th century, a little bit later on. And also the clinker-built ships probably had been around a little bit earlier than the 8th century. But what you have to remember is that then Scandinavian kings and petty kings would have to deal with each other as well as their neighbours from across the sea. So then there's a lot more centralisation going on at this period, which is then why I think this is the time when there are some becoming more powerful in Scandinavia. Then you obviously get some who are pushed out, and possibly these would be the ones who would then go off and raid. And that's all a very important part of the Viking Age, and I don't think you can push that back to 400 just because the Anglo-Saxons came in then. Okay, so my next point of interest is this map, which says, even today there are signs of the linguistic divide between Viking England in the north and east and Anglo-Saxon England in the southwest. So one of the issues with this map is that they have bairn and child. And so if I read the little key to the map there, it says, the Vikings did not eradicate Old English. Good observation. A sign of their limited impact compared to the earlier Anglo-Saxon invasion. Sorry, I read that wrong. A sign of their limited impact compared to the earlier Anglo-Saxon invasion. But remnants of their influence are still visible in modern English. For example, north and east of the line that demarcates the Danelaw, you are likely to hear bairn instead of child, which is more closely related to the Danish barn. Other similarities include armhole, for same as Danish armhole, for armpit, and hagworm, Danish hugorm, meaning adder. Okay, so a few issues with this map. One, likely to hear north and east of this line. I'm not sure. I've never heard anyone outside of Northumberland or some parts of the borders in Scotland use the term bairn. Possibly the older generation in Yorkshire. Correct me if I'm wrong, because I might be wrong. But that line includes sort of a lot of the north, like Lincolnshire and areas of that, and I've never heard people down there say bairn. Secondly, and possibly much more damaging to the argument they're trying to make, is that, okay, so they put that it's more closely related to the Danish barn. And while this is true, the problem I have with this argument is that you find this or something a cognate to this in many different languages. So they mention, obviously, Danish barn. It's also in Norwegian, in barn. It's also in West Frisian, bairn, which is a lot more similar to this and quite worrying for their argument, because they're positing that because of the Old Norse influence, they use bairn north of that line and child to the south of that line. Well, child is from child, which is indeed an Old English word for child, but another word for child is barn, so which is spelled B-E-A-R-N, or alternatively as barn, just as B-A-R-N. Obviously, spelling wasn't standardized at this point. So really this argument is a bit void, because obviously bairn can just as easily be from the etymological root of Old English, and probably is. Now possibly, and this is me sort of doing them a favour by coming up with this is what you could argue is that obviously because you had Old Norse speakers moving into that area in larger numbers than into the other areas of England at the time, that then you would have the fact that there are two population groups with a similar word, and so it's easier if they use that word rather than chilled, which is used in other areas, which would be harder for the Danes to understand, potentially. That's one of the arguments, but there are complications. Obviously, East Anglia, there is evidence that there was quite a lot of settlement there. Obviously, the largest area of settlement where we think, from place name evidence and also a lot of the genetic evidence as well, Yorkshire seems to be an area with the most Danish influence there, different parts of Yorkshire. But again, it just goes to show that with a map like this, it's lovely and simple, and it'd be great if it was that clear in history and with etymologies and linguistics and things like that, but it quite simply isn't. So it's a bit of an oversimplification of the whole issue that they're trying to point out here with this Scandinavian multi-ethnic culture, and that you can draw this nice line in the sand. Again, correct me if you are from one of these areas where they do say Ben, which is much further south than Yorkshire, then do give me a shout, because obviously I don't know everything, but I've just never heard it before. Now, this is an interesting point as well that they bring up several times and they allude to. So they say, however, some linguistics suggests that if Scandinavians and Anglo-Saxons had not met up, and in that process modified each other's languages, people in England would speak something more similar to Frisian or Danish, depending on whether the Anglo-Saxons or Vikings had won the language clash. I think they mean the Normans, not the Scandinavians at this point, because the reason that English is so different isn't because of the Vikings showing up. Sure, they had an influence. For example, we get some of our pronouns like there and things like that from them. They also probably helped to simplify the case system at points, and contributed some vocabulary to the modern English language, which, by the way, was more incorporated into Middle English as opposed to Old English, which is when we get a lot more Scandinavian words coming into the English language. But it's the Normans who really changed it a lot, with obviously bringing in French influences, where we get a lot of words from French and also from Latin to do with the church, rather than the Scandinavians coming. I don't know if this was just an error that they meant the Normans, or that they're actually putting forward the argument that it was the Scandinavians who changed English from Frisian and Danish. I'm not entirely sure. But again, I don't think that's a very solid argument. So some final remarks about the last paragraphs here. And if you're not aware, I am making another video about this article, related to this article, about this theory of the Anglo-Saxons wiping out the native British Celtic inhabitants of England before they arrived. But yeah, some last points. So one thing that I see repeated quite a lot is Anglo-Saxon being this big patron of English. And while this is true, I think this can be misconstrued in some ways. So it says he knew that without a history the English had no identity against the Danes, thus he saved the English language against further pidginization. I don't really think this is particularly true. Now, there is an explosion, and it's called the Alfredian Renaissance in this period with Alfred, and he starts to write things down in the English language. Now, before that, things had been written down in the English language, but this was largely things like Cadman's Hymn, for example, so not particularly high status things were written down in Old English in the period. That was Latin, that was the language that this was done in. However, from this point on, it became Old English for a little while, and then during the 10th century it switched back to Latin. Things, moved around. But the reason for this is that Latin was obviously not the language being spoken by the majority of the people in England. Old English was the vernacular tongue at the time. So people knew obviously how to speak Old English, and it would be easier to write Old English for them. But because of the Danish attacks, there'd been such massive upheaval that people had a lot less time to sit and to spend years learning Latin and how to write fancy Latin in manuscripts in monasteries, because obviously they were being attacked by the Danes. So it was easier because this skill was being lost, and because writing was such an important tool for Alfred, to have people writing down in Old English, because then they wouldn't have to spend all those years learning Latin, and they could just get started writing down the documents that they have to write down in Old English. And you even see in the manuscripts of the period of the later 9th century that the quality of them declines quite drastically as well. Also the scripts being used, sort of how neat they are, also declines during this period. And that's because of this great upheaval of the Great Heathen Army and the fight against the Danes. Alright, so I haven't really done too many videos like this, but I saw this article and I saw a lot of people sharing it and reading it, and I thought there were some serious points that needed addressing. Now, as I said, I am making another one I'm still working on. I'm doing quite a bit of extensive reading for it, so I can bring a few, maybe some points that people haven't thought of to do with the whole ethnic cleansing and the Anglo-Saxons coming into the British Isles and the native population and what happened to them. For a second video, again, referencing certain points of this article. I'll obviously have a link to the article in the description so you can read it yourself. And I would also like to say I am in the next couple of days doing my face reveal, and I would like to answer some of your questions on camera. So if you have any questions for me to do with the channel or about myself, or you know, even historical stuff if you want, then just put in the comments below, just write something like question for Hilbert so I can see it easily, and then whatever you'd like to know. You can also message me questions, obviously I'm on Facebook, also have an Instagram now if you'd like to follow that. DM me on Twitter, that's possible too, or via email, or in the comments here, it's all good. So thank you very much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed this one. Again, I've got another one coming out. I've got plenty more videos about the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons and etymology and things like that I talk about if you would like to see more. So thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up if you enjoyed this one, and tune in again for some more History with Hilbert.